Welcome, everyone, to this virtual summit sequel on people-powered infrastructure. I'm Brooke DeRenzis, the Chief Strategy Officer at National Skills Coalition. This is the third summit sequel in our series of summit sequels, which are a series of virtual events that continue the conversation from our annual Skills Summit. And we're focusing on federal and state policies that can contribute to an inclusive economic recovery. You can register for future summit sequels. We'll have 3 more after this one using a link that we'll provide in the chat. And don't forget to save the date for our annual Skills Summit, which will be held on May 1st through 3rd of 2023 in Washington, D.C. So with that, let's talk about the summit sequel we're here to talk about today. During today's summit sequel, we're going to focus on actions that state and local policymakers can take to create an inclusive infrastructure workforce in the transportation sector. And we're going to focus specifically on actions they can take as they work to implement the bipartisan infrastructure law, which passed last year and was signed into law last year. Now, while that law spans all types of infrastructure investments, we're going to focus our conversation today on transportation investments, rails, buses and transit, roads, bridges, etc. Our setup for today's conversation, we're thrilled to have a dynamic set of speakers join us for our conversation today. We're going to cover this sequel in 2 parts. First, my colleague Megan Evans is going to be talking with policy advisors from the Departments of Transportation and the Department of Labor about federal workforce priorities that are related to transportation provisions of the bipartisan infrastructure law. And then following that conversation, I'm going to moderate a discussion with 3 panelists who've been working to expand equitable training and employment opportunities in the infrastructure field. Now, we're going to leave room for questions at the end, so please put your questions in the chat as we go along. And we'll also be recording this event, and all registrants will receive a link to the recording. Before I turn it over to Megan, I just want to provide a little bit more context for today's discussion. So as I mentioned, last year, the federal government made a nearly $1 trillion investment in physical infrastructure. This included investments in transportation. Federal agencies, states, local communities are all turning their attention now to implementing that major investment and a decade's worth of projects that come with it. We know that implementing those projects is going to require a diverse, multi-generational workforce with training to build, maintain, and repair our infrastructure. And in fact, the bipartisan infrastructure bill has the potential to create millions of new good-paying jobs that could offer careers to workers who've been impacted by the COVID recession, as well as by long-standing structural inequities. Realizing that potential, though, is going to take some new policies, and it's going to take new policies that are focused on developing the next generation of infrastructure workers and doing so in an equitable way. So we're looking for policies that disrupt patterns of racial and gender-based occupational segregation in the infrastructure fields. We're looking for policies that invest in skills training, supportive services, and local employment strategies that give more people of color and women the opportunity to enter and advance in infrastructure careers. At National Skills Coalition, we just launched our People-Powered Infrastructure campaign. You can find resources, analysis of the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and you can find out more about how to get involved by visiting a link that's going to be dropped in the chat. So with all of that background, I'm going to turn it over to Megan to get us started with the first discussion that's part of this summit sequel. Megan.
Thanks, Brooke. Hello, everyone. I'm Megan Evans, Senior Government Affairs Manager with the National Skills Coalition, and I have the distinct honor of moderating our amazing panel representing the Department of Transportation and Employment and Training Administration. I'm joined today by Paige Shevlin, the Strategic Advisor for Infrastructure Workforce Development with the Department of Transportation. Whew, that's a mouthful, Paige. She has an incredibly robust resume in the workforce space, and we are delighted to have her share her expertise with us. I'm also joined by Molly Boucher, an NSC alum, who currently serves as a policy advisor for the Employment and Training Administration. Welcome, Paige and Molly. It is such a joy and privilege to have you with us today. Before we get started with the questions for Molly and Paige, I think it might be helpful to frame our conversation just a little bit. I think many people's minds go immediately to physical infrastructure, so roads, bridges, rail, when they think about this law, which is obviously understandable. But the bipartisan infrastructure law actually goes further than any previous surface transportation bill in acknowledging the need to train and create career pathways for historically underrepresented populations. For the first time since the 1980s, outside of pilot programs, incentives can be used to encourage the hiring of local workers on transportation projects without being considered as limiting competition. The law also includes billions of dollars in formula funds and competitive grants that will be awarded by the Department of Transportation. And some of those funds could be used for workforce development purposes. I know you both have been working to ensure that the implementation of the law maximizes the workforce components. As we talk today, I hope skills advocates will get a better understanding of what's in the bill, how the Biden administration is collaborating across agencies to prioritize training and implement the law in an equitable manner, and what role advocates can play to ensure that the bipartisan infrastructure law meets our nation's workforce needs. With that, Paige, I think it might be helpful to hear from you first, given your position in the Department of Transportation. What's actually included in the bipartisan infrastructure law that could be used to help build the transportation workforce?
Thank you, Megan, and thank you for having me here. Yes, there's definitely a lot in the bipartisan infrastructure law that I think can be helpful for workforce. I like to break it into three distinct areas. The first is direct funding. And there is very limited dedicated funding for workforce development in the bill. But there is one case, which is that there is a dedicated 5% set aside for transit agencies that are transitioning to zero emission fleets, right? So, if you're in an area where your local transit agency already has, hybrid buses, they may be transitioning to zero emission fleets. And in that case, they can get 5% of their funding for workforce development. That is going to be different depending on the grant size, but it's going to be somewhere between like $500,000 and $1 million that a transit agency could pull down for workforce development, which it is a substantial amount, and especially with partnerships, could be a really good way to start some new training programs that is meant for the incumbent workforce. The purpose of those funds is to avoid displacement of the current workforce as they transition to those zero emission fleets. So that is unfortunately the only dedicated source of funding for workforce development. I do want to bring up one other dedicated source for workforce development. It's not covered in the bipartisan infrastructure law, but I want people to be aware of it. We have rail grants. It's CRISI for short, but it's like the Railroad Improvement Program. And there are many different eligible activity types. One of those is workforce. And we actually are just putting out our most recent round of grants. And for the first time ever, we have two partnerships that are workforce partnerships that have won those grants. One is a partnership with an HBCU to create a new railroad engineering program. And the second is a Amtrak apprenticeship program. So we really want to see more partnerships like that, especially as we're building out the Northeast Corridor, as that is a part of the bipartisan infrastructure law. So those CRISI grants could be used to get some direct workforce dollars to help with that Northeast Corridor construction and the operations of the rail lines as they are built. Now, I'm going to move from direct funding, because there's not that much, to the funding that is flexible for states and localities to use for workforce. So most of our funding, I would say, there is an allowability to use the funding for workforce development if it is related to jobs on the project. So all of our competitive grants, we have put out, I believe, 6 notice of funding opportunities since I started in December. And almost all of those, I believe, can be used on workforce as a part of the application. So those applications are to cities and state departments of transportation. Let's say, the city of Minneapolis applies to do a road project. They can include in that workforce funding to help support training for jobs on that project. They could even write in that, they want to share some of that funding with a local community college or a workforce program. That is allowable within the rules of the law. And then there is also funding that states and localities have, formula funding, right? Similar to kind of, WIOA formula funding, right? This is the funding that goes through them, goes to them directly, and they can kind of use it for whatever they want. I believe Katie was going to put in the chat, we have a new fact sheet about how our state highway formula funds can be used for workforce development. This is a new flexibility under the infrastructure law. Prior to the infrastructure law, states were only allowed to use 0.5% of one of their major block grant programs. Now they can use all of their money from 4 major programs. And we would really like to encourage states to use this funding, especially where they do have gaps for highway projects. They are having a hard time finding workers. We need to make them aware that they have this funding available, and it was specifically written into the infrastructure law that they can use this funding for apprenticeship and pre-apprenticeship. And the fact sheet that Katie just shared, we developed in part for the 4 states that the National Governors Association is going to be working with, which have committed to using some of this highway funding. And I will share those 4 states just in case there's any possible partnerships there. It's Connecticut, North Carolina, Idaho, and Oregon. So all 4 of those states have committed to using some of that transportation funding. And then finally, I like to talk about the tools that are in the infrastructure law that can support workforce development. The most important of which you already brought up, Megan, is the local and economic hiring preferences. When state departments of transportation or city departments of transportation put in a requirement that the project has to have a certain number of people from the local area or from economically disadvantaged communities, that will, in many cases, lead to the creation of workforce programs. And in most cases where cities and states have those local hire requirements, they also fund workforce programs that are helping to train people that meet those parameters for the local hire requirement so that they can actually gain the skills to get into those jobs. So we think that's a really important tool. The only other tool that I really like to bring up, this is not a new tool, but just to be aware that, states and cities can also require a fraction of the project to be done by apprentices. So if they say, 20% of the project hours have to be performed by apprentices, that's known as an apprenticeship utilization rate. And that's a really important way to expand the number of apprentices that we have on projects and expand our registered apprenticeship programs in the trades.
Thanks, Paige. It sounds like there is both money and tools available for states and localities to use. And it also sounds like there's significant opportunity for alignment with the Department of Labor and the work that you're doing. So that brings me to Molly. How is the Department of Labor working with DOT to build the pipeline of skilled workers? And where will ETA's work be focused?
Yeah, thank you, Megan. And thank you, Brooke, also for bringing us in and giving us that great intro and place setting. A little bit about, I guess, what Department of Labor has been doing and how we're sort of strategically partnering with DOT in this. So obviously there's a really urgent need to create pathways to high quality jobs as infrastructure is unlocking hundreds of billions of dollars in new investments, certainly in transportation, and really we're talking about not just construction and maintenance workers and the sort of jobs that we're trying to fill. There's a whole number of skilled tradespeople, train and bus operators, and so many more really fundamental jobs to the infrastructure that we frankly just live and depend on. So to make sure that all of these new resources are frankly creating pathways to good paying jobs, and also making sure that there is that free choice to form a union when we're talking about what job quality means, what equity means, and making sure those sort of priorities are fundamentally integrated into infrastructure implementation. What we've done, or more or less what DOT and DOL have done together is that we agreed that there's essentially a need for a highly aligned effort to not only attract, but retain and empower a very diverse workforce and qualified workforce to build and maintain our transportation system. So, you know, while we're doing this work and have been doing this work, once we essentially aligned and brought together and formalized this commitment, more or less what we've done is we announced, I believe in March of this year, this formalized partnership with the signing of a memorandum of understanding where the two departments are now jointly promoting the creation of good infrastructure and transportation jobs. And again, doubling down on the necessity of that commitment and that focus on equitable workforce development strategies and really purposefully, proactively building those into infrastructure projects, technical assistance, with workforce stakeholders, with transit agencies or transit authorities at the state level, at the local level, and really breaking down the fundamentals of what does it mean to proactively consider communities who have been overlooked or underserved communities who have not had the access, frankly, to good quality jobs, to pathways that build economic security, again, not only for individuals, but whole families, whole communities. And what are the strategies and what does it look like in a very practical sense to build that into funding announcements at, you know, at the federal level directly with DOT, but what does it look like even in individual projects, and how can implementers, how can project leads bring in the variety of voices that are necessary at the community level to make sure that, again, we're realizing this vision of having a diverse, highly qualified, highly skilled infrastructure workforce that reflects the communities where infrastructure dollars are being spent. So like I said, this is a very cooperative effort. We're in very constant conversation with DOT, and we're, again, placing that really a really focused emphasis, frankly, on just drawing on the strength and creativity of every single worker in America, including the recruitment, training, and retraining. Again, because we're not talking about just bringing in new people, it's also about creating pathways that are going throughout the gamut. So there's the upskilling component as well, making sure that there is movement along the pathway, and so that pathways that already exist are improved, and also that every infrastructure job is able to be genuinely a good job, a sustainable job, and one that creates that economic sustainability and security for whole communities.
So Molly, I hear you talking about the need to create equity in the workforce when these jobs are created, which I think drives us into our next topic of, you know, what specifically the Department of Transportation is doing to ensure that the implementation promotes workforce equity for historically underrepresented groups. So Paige, I'd love to hear about some of that work.
Yes, absolutely. We are, first of all, we are putting in priorities in all of our competitive grants. You know, I talked earlier about some of the competitive grants, which can be used for workforce projects. We also can put in, you know, selection criteria, sort of, you know, like points in a way, right? And we have put in selection criterion around how the states and cities are planning for, you know, the workforce needs of their projects. And both how they're planning on creating good quality jobs, and then how they are working to bring in underrepresented populations. Specifically, what we have called out in some of these, you know, grant opportunities is that, you know, we want to see them providing supportive services, either directly or in partnership with, you know, a community-based organization or a workforce partner, or, you know, a community college. So we have sort of defined high quality training programs as training programs that include those supportive services, because we know that that's important for underrepresented populations. We also have asked for changes in hiring practices. Going back to what I said earlier about these local and economic hiring preferences, we have asked to see those policies be used, or that other hiring policies be changed in order to actively bring in more underrepresented populations. I think, we try and make it as clear as possible that it's not just about skills or training, that there are other changes in both the recruitment process, the hiring process, and the workplace safety that we want to see. We have several notice of funding opportunities where we also call out that we would like to see training around fair and safe workplaces, or other steps that project owners, states and cities could take to make sure that those workplaces are free of harassment, because we know that even when women and people of color enter into some of these trades, that the retention rates are low, and that is in part because of the harassment that they face on the job. So that's really important to signal that we want to see active plans in place to reduce that harassment. That's what we're emphasizing in our competitive grants. You'll see in that fact sheet, in terms of what we are encouraging states to do with their own funding, we also have a heavy emphasis on bringing in those underrepresented populations, in the use of supportive services, and in pre-apprenticeship programs that lead into registered apprenticeship.
I know we're somewhat early in the implementation, but have either of you seen any states or municipalities that are proactively doing these things very well? I think our folks listening in would love to hear some examples if you have any to share.
Well, Oregon is a state that was already using that 0.5% of the surface transportation block grant, and they created a highway funding partnership that primarily provides supportive services. And they, found that over 60% of the apprentices needed those supportive services. And, that includes the funding for tools and gas and transportation and childcare as well. So I think that's one example of, a state that is taking that on. There's also transit agencies, maybe Shinga can talk about this a little bit later, but there are transit agencies that I think are doing really smart things on trying to increase the retention of their operators, and also create pathways into higher paying jobs. Yeah, so those are the kind of two main areas I would bring up. We hope to be able to highlight many more examples when we release our first round of DOT grants sort of at the end of this summer. All these NOFOs we've been putting out, some of them have closed, the application deadline have closed, and so we will finally be at the stage where we're making awards. And I'm confident that there will be many examples of partnerships of cities and states that are thinking about workforce in that early project planning phase, and specifically have programs to bring in underrepresented populations and partnerships. Really, all of that, as you know, has to be done through partnerships, either with a workforce board or some sort of community-based organization or college.
Molly, I don't want to bypass you in case you have another example that you wanted to promote.
Oh, I was just going to say, Paige, I think you actually made a really good note with Oregon, but I was going to note on some of the apprenticeship utilization rates and some of the project labor agreements that have been implemented in a number of cities. But I think I'd actually prefer to send a bunch of follow-ups if I can, and I think I can do that a little bit better if I can look at my notes.
Wonderful. So then I think this all ties into, how our skills advocates on the ground can help ensure that states and municipalities are actually investing in infrastructure workforce. And I think that ties back to your comments, Molly, about equity, and your comments, Paige, about the availability of funding. So I'd love to, if you both could wrap it up in a bow for us on what you think that skills advocates can do on the ground to help with this effort. Molly, since why don't you go first, since Paige went first with the last question?
Yeah, no worries. I love this question. So thank you for including this. I think, skills advocates on the ground, I mean, they have the eyes and ears, not only to the community and the people who are potentially looking for jobs, they have the connections to the worker centers, maybe to the unions who have the pulse of the community that, is going to get an infrastructure project, has been needing an infrastructure project for probably decades, and now the funding is finally here. So when you're thinking about like people who are actually on the ground are, the natural conveners, they're the ones with the best knowledge. And then when you're thinking about, maybe national organizations or intermediaries, policy shops and what have you, they're the ones who frankly have much more insight, I think, and they have the sort of open window into how to connect all of the locals and then also potentially those federal partners and get everyone in a room. So I say all that to say, which I could have said with maybe one word, but these intermediaries and these locals, they have just this really incredible power as conveners, which is so fundamental to this process, because I think for months now, and Paige, I remember they're at an event in March, I think we heard the same, that so much of the work at this point in the stage of implementation bill is really just our bipartisan infrastructure law, sorry, I will not do acronyms, is just about getting the word out. A lot of, at least for the workforce side, a lot of boards, state and locals that I've heard about, they're aware of bill and they're aware of the opportunities, but they frankly they're unfamiliar with the structure of how to partner with, their local transportation agency. They don't know how to talk to a transit authority. They don't know who those people are. They don't know how to get in the room with them. They just don't know what they don't know. And so when you have a wealth of information and knowledge on one side and the workforce, and the wealth of information and knowledge on the transit side, but those two aren't necessarily able to navigate that space and find that nexus where they can share all of those good ideas and, lay them out on the table, I think that's where we know that we have an issue. And so that's at least what I've heard as, I guess a stumbling block or a barrier. So coming back to my original point, I really think that's where, organizations like NSC and also states and local organizers and what have you, they have just so much power. That ability as a convener and as a connector is really so fundamental to make sure that we don't stumble in implementation of the bipartisan infrastructure law. To make sure that, we're all full steam ahead in our brains, just to make sure that we don't trip on the way with all of our good ideas.
Thanks, Molly. Paige, I also wanted to give you an opportunity to answer this question, because I think we had a robust conversation in our last call about how folks on the ground could connect with their states as well.
Yeah, I don't want to pretend like it's easy, because I will say we are consistently hearing that this is hard. Transportation entities don't tend to work a lot with workforce entities, and it's hard at the state level, it's hard at the local level, but I would encourage everyone to just keep on pushing. I think the local level, all in all, is probably a little bit more innovative, and so talk to your city government, who the transportation leaders within them. You could start with the city leader who you work with on workforce development and say, hey, do you know about all this stuff that's going on over here, right? And try and get them to make that engagement. Your local transit agencies, counties sometimes are house the transit agencies. So think about where project funding is coming from locally. I could also probably, put in a link where you can see some of our past grantees. It might help you to kind of understand like who's getting money in your local area. But try and start talking to them now, because I guarantee you in a year and a half, that's one thing we got to realize, there's a time lag on all of this, right? We are just now, going to be funding, saying, hey, city of St. Louis, we're going to give you money to do this. And then it's going to take the city of St. Louis a while to bid out that project and get it going, right? Up to a year and a half. But a year and a half to 2 years from now, all these people are going to be knocking on the doors of workforce saying, can you help us find workers? And so I know it's hard to kind of get them to think ahead, but try as much as you can to get them to think ahead. And then when they do come knocking, please let them know that they have funds they can use so that they don't just use all the workforce system funds.
I think that's such great advice. And I realize we're running up on our time, which I can't believe that we've, gone through 30 minutes already, because I think we could all sit here and talk all day. But I wanted to say how grateful I am for your time and your incredible insights. Before I turn it over to the next panel, I do want to give you each, a minute or so to give closing remarks or parting comments. So Paige, why don't you go first?
Well, I would say that the summer, is going to be a really exciting time for DOT and workforce, both because we are going to be announcing these winners of all the grants that we put out. We're going to be announcing particularly, the transit dollars that I mentioned and the entities that are going to be using some of that 5% set aside for workforce. I guarantee you, and again, maybe Shinga can talk about this later, but I guarantee you not all those transit agencies have thought about what they're going to do with that 5%. So there will be opportunities for partnership around that. And then just one thing I want to flag is later this week, we will be putting out our new regulations, or the notice of proposed rulemaking that around EV charging installation. The Department of Transportation was able to define what it means to be a qualified technician for the purposes of installing EV chargers. Without giving away what's in the NPRM, there is going to be a very, very, very strong emphasis on registered apprenticeship and the use of both registered apprentices and the graduates of registered apprenticeship programs. And every single state in the country is going to have to figure out how to expand their registered apprenticeship programs for electricians. So that is a really great partnership opportunity for all of you. And we'll be sharing more about that next week probably, and hope to have some helpful resources available for the workforce side as well as the departments of transportation that will be implementing that.
I feel like we're getting the inside scoop on that. Molly, did you have any closing remarks or comments?
I really want to double down on what I said a little bit earlier. The convening power of local entities and intermediaries really can't be overstated. And borrowing from Paige, a lot of people, a lot of agencies, who have suggested they'll be using workforce funds or partnering, they don't know what they don't know. And this is a great time to offer yourself up as a resource. I really just think it's really about over communication and really hammering home, the same points that we've always been talking about just what are the tenets of a high quality job? What are the tenets of high quality workforce development? What does it mean to build that into the workforce intentionally and build that into infrastructure plans intentionally? And don't feel like you're being repetitive, because frankly, everyone needs to hear it, and it probably takes a few more times for everyone to grasp it fully, just because I know we're steeped in workforce development stuff day by day, but it sounds like a whole new language to anyone who's not in that space every single day. So
I think that's such important advice to close on. So thank you both once again for joining us today. I really appreciated it. And I think it's really valuable for our network to hear from experts in the agencies like you both. I look forward to working with you in the future. And I guess now I'll turn it over to Brooke for our next panel. Thanks again.
Thanks, Megan. Thanks so much for facilitating that great conversation, and special thanks to Paige and Molly for taking time to join us today and give us a sense of what has already come through the agencies and a sense of what's yet to come. So I am thrilled to be joined by a panel of 3 respondents, and so much came up in our conversation with Paige and Molly around local training and hiring, intermediaries and industry partnerships, apprenticeship and pre-apprenticeship support services. And so we're going to turn our attention to digging into that set of topics together. So let me first introduce them. I'm joined by Hector Hueso, the California Director of Jobs to Move America, Randy Stamper, the Associate Vice Chancellor for Career Education and Workforce Programs at the Virginia Community College System, and Xinge Wang, the Deputy Director of International Transportation Learning Center. Thank you all so much for taking time out of your day to be here with us. Xinge, I'm going to start with you, and Paige already kind of teed you up here, but your organization is focusing on the frontline transportation workforce, and you've done a lot of research on the opportunities and the challenges currently facing the transportation sector when it comes to the workforce. And so wondering if you can talk a little bit about what those opportunities and challenges are and what practices you think state and local leaders, and I know you focus specifically on transit, should invest in to address challenges and to build a more equitable transportation workforce. So just a small question there, you know, challenges
Sure.
and solutions for the transportation workforce.
Yeah, I'll try to cover that in 5 minutes. Thanks, Brooke. So as Brooke has implied, my work has been deeply rooted in the public transportation industry, so I will focus primarily on that sector. But many of the other transportation sectors, such as trucking, airlines, railroad, and even other broader infrastructure sectors like water and wastewater, we all face very similar labor issues. And some of the practices I share can hopefully apply to others. First and foremost, we have a crisis in transit with operator and technician shortages. And you've heard through many news coverages, this is caused by a variety of factors: retirement of our experienced workers, competitiveness of our compensation levels, our image issues as an industry, and all that intensified by COVID, where safety and health concerns have become really top priority among a lot of the frontline operators and technicians. We have workers out sick or choosing to retire early. And now we're experiencing the tightest labor market since World War II. So a little bit more on the retirement and turnover. The median age of US workers was 42 years in 2021. And for the bus service and urban transit industry, it was 52.7. And that higher median age of urban transit workers is largely attributable to the older age of bus drivers that constitute about 60% of the workforce. And a large percentage of these workers are going to retire in the coming years, and they have already started to do so in droves during COVID. Turnover among bus operators is also very high. Some of the new operators do not stay for more than a few months because of the working conditions, hard shifts, and safety and health concerns. And exits from the industry, because of the retirement and turnover, will produce a need to hire and train a large number of transit workers in the next 10 years. So to alleviate some of the immediate labor shortage issues, many transit agencies are experimenting with bonus pays and other incentives to lure people in, but we know it's just as critical to improve the working conditions, protect our frontline worker safety and health, reduce operator assaults, and to cultivate a learning environment for our frontline workers to actually stay. We all know other industries are also in the same boat, seeking the same pool of talented workers. And this can be viewed as a challenge, but also an opportunity where we can collaborate on developing a lot of common pipeline and entry-level skills training. Secondly, I want to bring up that there is a critical need for worker skills training due to technological advances And there has been a lack of investment in consistent and high quality training at many transit agencies over the years. As Paige has mentioned, a lot of them are getting this funding, but may not know what to do with the 5%. And we know in transit, the largest skill gaps are still among the blue collar bus, rail, facilities technicians, electricians, signals operators, elevator, escalator, mechanics. These professions do not require 4-year degrees, but do need a significant amount of on-the-job training. And we should not lose sight of that, even in the middle of all this operator shortage crisis. New technologies, including zero emission buses, autonomous shuttles and buses, automatic fare systems, positive train control on the commuter rail side, these all have implications on the future hiring and training needs. Some say today's transit buses and rail vehicles are becoming computers on wheels. So some of the job skills will become obsolete, some roles will be changed and redefined, and some new jobs will be created. This can also be a basis for attracting people, particularly young people who are interested in technologies, and especially in the green technologies within a green industry. Last but not least, I want to bring up diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility within the transit workforce. Women and minorities continue to be disproportionately underrepresented in the higher skilled and higher paid transit jobs, especially among the technician ranks. Women represent 1% of all bus and truck mechanics and 2% of rail car repairers, whereas 41% of the bus operators are women. There's 27 and 29% of non-white bus mechanics and rail mechanics, whereas 58% of bus operators are non-white. So you can see there's a lot of potential to tap into the existing workforce and the diverse community for talents among these underrepresented groups. And that is especially critical in a tight labor market as we're experiencing right now. So we need very effective outreach into these targeted communities that transit serves to draw on these talents and make them succeed through pre-apprenticeship, apprenticeship, and ongoing mentorship and coaching. Apprenticeship itself can be a major DEIA tool and can be a huge win-win for both the agencies and the community they serve. First of all, it's an earn while you learn model, so candidates don't have to choose between work and school, and we need to provide a lot of supportive services such as subsidized housing, childcare, transportation, you all mentioned earlier, and all that can contribute to the success of women and minorities in apprenticeship programs. So I'll stop there and we'll talk more about some of the examples of locations experimenting with different models.
Thanks, Shinga. And I know we'll come back to pre-apprenticeship, apprenticeship, and supportive services. I want to turn now to you, Hector, because one of the things that Shinga was talking about was really the opportunity to tap into the talent of local communities where infrastructure projects are going to take place, where we're going to be investing in transit. And as we heard from Paige, the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Department of Transportation are allowing for local hiring and training. And this is a place where Jobs to Move America has been involved and in fact created the U.S. Employment Plan, which is a tool that cities, states, and public agencies can use to build training, good jobs, and equity into the bidding process for public transportation projects. And so wanting to know if you can tell us a little bit more about how the U.S. marginalized workers.
Great, yeah, I'm happy to, Brooke. I think it might be helpful to first begin with an understanding of the traditional approach to public investment, what it's been and sort of what it's actually gotten us. Because for generations, we've had public agencies and institutions operate with this idea that being stewards of public money meant only awarding contracts to the lowest cost bidder, regardless of any other factors that could have contributed to creating more public good. And this race to the bottom sort of mentality, we know has disproportionately hurt working families, especially communities of color. It's the same kind of thinking that has led to offshoring of good jobs and globalization, and some of the most vile examples of sweatshop or terrible working conditions, not just globally, but even domestically here in the US. And so one particularly devastating piece of this sort of thinking has been that it's turned our biggest asset, which is workers and communities, into just costs that need to be managed or zeroed out with no expectation for companies to create good jobs or with family sustaining wages or quality training programs. And so tools like the US Employment Plan really flip that model on its head, because as big businesses compete for lots of these lucrative public contracts, they're asked to disclose information about the number of jobs and the quality of jobs that will be created if they're actually awarded a contract. They're asked about training investments and groups or community organizations that they'll be working with to recruit from just disadvantaged populations. And when you ask those questions ahead of a contract award, you create a situation where companies are competing upwards on job quality and training investment. And so the US Employment Plan is a tool that local agencies can use to assess those kinds of commitments, give them an actual dollar value, and that value can be used to make a competitive grant application look more attractive compared to, say, a competitor who's unwilling to make those kinds of investments in job quality or worker training. So it's not just a way to get sort of more transparency and better quality jobs out of public contracting, but it's also a way to lift standards for whole industries. And commitments that are made in order to win the contracts in the first place, they would become part of the deliverables after a contract is awarded, with regular, at least quarterly reporting after that. And so Jobs to Move America has sort of developed this model. We call it public goods for the most public good. And we feel like it's the best way to make use of the trillions of dollars that government at all levels is already spending. We're not even getting into the historic amounts of investment coming out of this administration. This is trillions annually that come just as a result of maintaining our roads, maintaining our transit systems, building bridges, getting our kids safely to and from school. All of those public expenses can be harnessed for more public good.
Thanks, Hector. And if you want to share a link at some point with Katie where folks can find out more about the U.S. Employment Plan, we'll be sure to drop it in the chat so that folks can find out more about it. I mean, I think one of the other things that I was thinking about when I heard you talking is, you know, by building in that type of thinking about training, about employment, about career advancement and quality jobs at the front end of thinking about projects and about contracting or bidding for projects, it also creates the opportunity to have some of that alignment conversation that we heard Paige and Molly talking about being so critical between workforce stakeholders and local community organizations and businesses or transit agencies that are looking to do training and hiring. Look like and some of the work you've been involved in California. So just wanted to make that connection point there. Randy, I want to turn to you because you are at a community college system in created by the Infrastructure Act are going to require training of 6 months or less. So we're talking about shorter term training, and they think that there might be a need for community colleges to be providing. You've been thinking about shorter term training, obviously, at community colleges and working on this throughout the state of Virginia. In fact, you started an infrastructure academy in Virginia's community colleges to train workers for jobs in the infrastructure field. And so just want to hear a little bit more from you around how community college systems are thinking about training people for the infrastructure field and connecting students to jobs and careers in that field.
Sure. Thank you, Brooke. And good afternoon, everybody. And many thanks to Brooke and to the National Skills Coalition for pulling this together this afternoon. It's very timely and very well thought out. So in Virginia, we have 23 community colleges and 40 campuses. In the eastern part of the state, we have one of the 2 deepest ports in the United States for cargo ships. And then we have 2 north-south arteries, I-95 and I-81, and 1 east-west artery, I-64, where a lot of cargo gets shipped. And we have some serious infrastructure from a roads standpoint, some serious infrastructure under bay tunnels in the eastern part of the state, and a lot of work being done. So we are working across all 23 colleges and with several of the road building industry associations to expand what Brooke said, the Infrastructure Academy. Several years ago, we entered into agreements with the asphalt industry and with the Virginia Department of Transportation to start what's called VCAT, the Virginia Virginia Transportation Construction Academy, whereby we train and certify all of the workers for contractors who work in the road building industry, whether that is asphalt, quality control, aggregates, those sorts of things. We also entered into an agreement with the Heavy Construction and Contractors Association and created a heavy equipment operator program, which is now operating at 7 or 8 of the colleges across the state in order to train the workers who operate the equipment for the contractors who actually build the roads. It takes a lot of resources. It takes a lot of focus, and it takes a lot of deliberate and concerted partnership with the industry to ensure that the curriculum is correct, that the faculty are recruited, that we have the equipment we need in order to be at the leading edge of industry changes. So all 23 colleges are involved. As the academy grows, we'll be looking at consistent curricula across all 23 colleges. For the broader discussion of infrastructure, roads and tunnels are certainly a huge part of it, but we're also looking at broadband expansion. We're also looking at wind, both onshore and offshore, and finding ways to allow the colleges to specialize in the kind of training that is aligned to what those infrastructure projects will be in their regions. But regardless of the regions, because of the aforementioned port, the arteries, road constructions, bridges, and tunnels are a huge part of what we're doing. And it is changing the kinds of conversations we have with our industry partners. They're much deeper, they're much more deliberate, and they're much more detailed.
Great. Thanks, Randy. I want to come back. We're going to talk about industry and sector partnerships in a minute, and I want to come back to you on that last point you made when we get there. Before that, I just want to lift up something you said and have a follow-up question. You mentioned that it takes resources and resources for the colleges to invest in infrastructure training. We know that training also includes costs for students, right? We're talking about obviously tuition, but also the cost of transportation, the cost of childcare if they're parents, the cost of equipment and supplies to be in a training program. And we know that mitigating those costs are key to advancing equity. And we know that because economic supports for services can be used to fill resource gaps that have been caused by structural, racial, and gender inequities in income. And we know that those gaps have been exacerbated by the pandemic. And so just wanted you to talk a little bit more about how you are using federal and state funding streams there in Virginia to get students the resources they need to thrive in the academy.
Sure, great question. So in Virginia, and there was a question in the chat about whether or not these programs are credit, non-credit, or both, and they're both. The entry into the field is really focused on non-credit short-term training to get people kind of the baseline elementary foundational skills they need to work in whatever industry, in whatever line of infrastructure they may be interested in pursuing. So we have pathways that include both credit and non-credit. We are fortunate in the last 5 or 6 years, our General Assembly and our governors have supported investments in those fields. So we have tuition assistance for non-credit industry credentials and training, as well as credit-bearing industry credentials and training, specifically, for these kind of skilled trades. So that helps to handle the tuition part. But you're right that just paying for tuition does often not cover the true cost of attendance. So we have done a variety of things. We do our very best to get as many referrals to WIOA as we can for supportive services. We have invested, we've been participating in the SNAP 50/50 program with our Department of Social Services for the last couple of years to generate funds that we have invested in a platform called Single Stop, which is an online platform that helps screen and connect students to a wide variety of public and private supports. So think food assistance, TANF, rental assistance, healthcare, tax credits, those sorts of things, as well as local foundations that may be providing supports to students. So all 23 colleges use Single Stop in order to help students connect to the non-academic supports that they need in order to be successful. And I'll just give you one example. One of the Richmond area colleges, they had a new president come in a couple of years ago, and she did a study of dropouts over the last 5 years and found that the average GPA of a dropout at her college was 3.1. So it is not a matter of academic preparedness or the ability to do the coursework that causes dropouts. It is everything else in a community college student's life that comes into play, whether that's a flat tire on a car or needing to provide childcare or elder care. So we are investing we are targeting both federal and state funds as well as private funds in order to provide those kind of supports. We have a very robust career coaching program whereby students can come in and meet with someone who's not an academic advisor. They're not advising on what classes to take or what your class schedule should look like. They're advising on what is the proper career, what is the best way for you to achieve that career, and then what do you need in order to overcome whatever challenges you may have to pursuing that workforce development or academic training in order to achieve that career.
Thanks, Randy. That's really helpful. One of the things that obviously I hear you talking about is aligning resources across different programs. And when I say programs, I mean programs that can be provided by different stakeholders. And so I do want to turn now to this conversation about industry partnerships, because we heard both Paige and Molly talk about intermediaries, partnerships that convene and align different stakeholders, and you all are working, as you talked about, with industry leaders, including employers, through partnerships. And at National Skills Coalition, you know, we are excited about industry partnerships because they can be a proven model for helping workers both enter and advance in a local industry, get that full set of services, both technical skills training and supportive services. And they also are a proven model for helping local companies support an inclusive talent ecosystem. And so I want to hear a little bit more about what the industry partnerships that you all are working with look like, and also what policymakers can be doing to promote more industry partnerships, particularly partnerships that can bring an equity lens to the infrastructure field. And so Hector, I thought we could start with you because I know that Jobs to Move America is involved in a transit high road training partnership in California. Can you tell us more about it? How is it meeting the needs of both workers and employers? How is it expanding training, hiring, and career advancement for historically marginalized workers? And then last, like, what is the state of California doing from a policy perspective to support that practice on the ground?
Sure, I appreciate the question. You know, the High Road Training Partnership that you mentioned is a really innovative and exciting sort of program because it makes workers, organizations that represent workers, and organizations that represent communities, really makes them part of the decision-making process with equal say sort of at the table for how training initiatives roll out. The funds for HRTP programs aren't just available to anyone who wants to apply. It's specifically for companies who are in sectors that are going to help the state address climate change or meet their greenhouse gas reduction goals. And to be considered for funding, you have to have a formalized agreement between the company, the employer itself, and a group that represents workers or community members. And so they actually have to disclose on their application how the partners will have an equal say in administering the program, equal say in determining how the training will not just benefit the company, but also workers and communities as well. And this is a really kind of exciting and interesting point to raise because of the unique focus on climate, because this is specifically for jobs in that emerging, that will affect our response to climate change in that sector. It is focused on equity because workers and community groups are made formal partners in the decision making. And of course, it's focused on jobs and getting impacted communities into sustainable careers with a career path and growth and learning that they will have with them for life on their career trajectory. And it's especially exciting because having seen this program sort of grow over the last couple of years, the resources that exist for it are very close to now matching the state's own allocation for WIOA. And so it's been interesting to see the comparison between sort of these two programs, one that is so focused specifically on climate, equity, and jobs, and then our sort of legacy workforce program, which for a long time, a big criticism of it has been that it hasn't called for any kind of accountability for companies or the businesses who benefit from those resources to have to make any kind of sort of commitment to a job quality or higher standards for recruiting or training people, especially folks from disadvantaged communities. So side by side, there's a real, I think, interesting dichotomy that the two programs pose.
Thanks, Hector. And just to follow up, is it right that the state of California has provided funding for the partnerships to do convening and training, but also like is supporting technical assistance and peer communities and evaluations? That's my understanding of the way the state is supporting. Is that right?
Yes, the funds are a lot more flexible than what most workforce practitioners might be used to, because as you mentioned, it allows for planning and doing a lot of the work that it takes to get formalized partnerships off the ground. An example of this that Shinga is actually the expert on, may talk more about, is actual labor sort of management partnerships, especially for groups of folks who don't have that history of working together and sharing decision making. The funds don't just strictly have to be used for enrollment, placement, exit, those old sort of metrics. It can be used to support the formation of these kinds of partnerships for continued partnership in the long term.
Perfect. And that was a perfect segue to Shinga, because that type of funding for that type of partnership development is so critical. And workforce funds, including WIOA funds, can be used for that, but states don't have to make the decision to use that. And so Shinga, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about like why that planning and convening is important, what you're seeing in all of your research and work, particularly around industry partnerships. And I know the work that you do is focused on labor management partnerships, and what should policymakers be thinking about to support partnerships?
Sure. I keep on getting great cues today from the previous speakers, so thanks to you all. So obviously, labor and management partnerships are essential for apprenticeship programs. It's a must-do component. You cannot not involve your frontline representatives in a joint apprenticeship program, especially in a highly unionized frontline workforce such as transit. And labor is especially helpful with recruitment and outreach into the diverse communities. There's no better ambassadors for transit agencies than its existing operators and technicians, telling their brothers, sisters, cousins, nephews how great a career they can make in transit with great pay and benefits, plenty of learning opportunities to move up the ladder. And I can give you a few examples of how states have invested in these labor management partnerships on training development. So the state of Pennsylvania has for many years, probably 18 years, invested in the Keystone Transit Career Ladder Partnership. It's a joint endeavor by the transit agencies and local unions in Pennsylvania, led by SEPTA and TWU Local 234 in Philadelphia. The Keystone program built very strong labor and management partnerships dedicated to addressing the major skills gaps caused by the new technologies coming into buses and trains, and also the changing demographics of maintenance workforce. And it eventually morphed into a statewide partnership where larger agencies provided training seats to help out small urban and rural transit agencies that lacked the internal training capacity. And recently, they've really started building equity into their program. They are seeking state funding and probably have already received state funding for equity in their elevator escalator apprenticeship program, which, as I mentioned earlier, among these maintenance ranks, it's generally fewer women, if any, and fewer minority workers. So this is very intentional build-up for involving more diversity into the apprenticeship program. And another state, as Hector has already mentioned, the state of California is deeply involved in a frontline workforce training and apprenticeship partnership between Valley Transit Authority and ATU 265 in San Jose, through the funding of an entity called Joint Workforce Investment. So VTA had difficulty hiring qualified mechanics off the streets, And they built this strong labor management partnership program to develop apprenticeship programs for service workers, which is a much more diverse group than mechanics. So it really worked, and the ranks of the mechanics now include many more people of color and women. There was a lot more details on this particular case in a study done by the Center of Wisconsin Strategies, and Katie is posting a link to that report. The second link that I asked Katie to post really includes several of the labor management partnerships that we have documented over the years. And that is actually under the zero emission bus fleet workforce transition resources that we have put together recently. So I encourage everyone to go there and read up on the many cases that we have, we can draw upon across the country.
Thanks, Shinga. I'm going to stick with you on this and invite Hector and Randy in with any final thoughts. On apprenticeship, I want to talk a little bit more about apprenticeship. We heard a lot about apprenticeship. It sounds like we got a preview about an expansion of electrician registered apprenticeships for EV charging from Page. And so one of the things we've been thinking about at National Skills Coalition is what strategies are necessary so that people of color and women can really thrive in apprenticeship programs, given the history of race-based and gender exclusion. And so want to hear more from you. Some of the things we've been thinking about are things like pre-apprenticeship programs with culturally responsive and responsible community organizations, diverse mentorship that supports underrepresented workers in participating in apprenticeship programs, supportive services through pre-apprenticeship and apprenticeship, particularly given that apprentices are still building their wages when they're apprentices. And just want to open it up to hear from you all around what are the strategies necessary to kind of surround apprenticeship to support success, particularly in terms of diversifying the infrastructure workforce pipeline. So I don't know, Shinga, do you want to start, or Hector?
I guess I would kick it off then. Yeah. So I want to echo everything that you've said. Pre-apprenticeship is a very effective and cost-effective model to help women and minorities overcome barriers to enter these non-traditional fields. And these programs can include targeted outreach to diverse communities, especially those disadvantaged and underrepresented. We can have a focus on women in non-traditional jobs. And I can share later another study that we did with Chicago Women in the Trades on recruiting women into transit and rail sectors. We can work in collaboration with organizations that can help businesses connect with and prepare a diverse group of candidates. And these organizations may include local community-based organizations that provide work readiness training and connects candidates to supportive services, CTE high schools, community colleges, Job Corps. And we found that these targeted outreach works best when it involves frontline workers telling their own stories to the communities they represent. One particular case I want to bring up is a few years ago, the ITLC partnered with Consortium for Worker Education in New York City and TWU Local 100's Training and Upgrade Fund, as well as an entity called the New York Atlas Alliance for Transportation and Logistics Advancement Services. We delivered a public transportation industry overview pre-apprenticeship class to CDL students at the South Bronx Overall Economic Opportunity Development Corporation. We call it SOBRO. And the session was really a segment of our transportation core competencies curriculum. And we had class participants aging from 18 to 24, coming in from very diverse backgrounds. They explored the evolution of public transportation, the critical role of transit as a public service, the range of career opportunities and pathways they can explore. And we brought in a female elevator escalator mechanic who used to be an apprentice herself, and also an experienced bus operator from New York City Transit, to provide a realistic, a day in the life kind of account of frontline transit workers, and also talk about the existing and emerging transportation technologies. So that kind of program really emphasizes that engaging the frontline workforce in this kind of mentorship and coaching of underrepresented workers, candidates, serves a double purpose. On the one hand, you have boosted morale of the mentors themselves, giving them a strong sense of passing on the legacy and contributing to the success of a younger generation. And on the other, the mentees themselves feel like they have a go-to person and someone they can share their joys and frustrations in their new career endeavor and learn from the role model they may share similar backgrounds with. So they are set up for success rather than failure.
Thanks, Shinga. Hector, do you want to weigh in here on this question of kind of how we can make apprenticeship most accessible and successful?
Yeah, well, I want to echo absolutely everything that Shinga mentioned. I feel like that covered it succinctly. The only additional thing that I would add is that what I've seen as some of the most successful examples for workers sort of reimagining their role at their own job and in this economy has been in situations where they actually have decision making and a say in how training happens, how recruitment happens. And this is really much bigger than just powerful transformative training initiatives and career pathways. At the core of this is, what are things that we can do to actually create democracy on the job, right? Where workers are respected for their talents, especially in industries where often it's whatever management says goes. And so I really want to lift up labor management partnerships that Shinga mentioned, some of the requirements for formalized agreements between workers and community groups and companies that exist with some of the training programs we work with. But would challenge listeners to the presentation today to think about, are the initiatives that they're part of kind of tokenizing workers and taking their participation for granted, or are they actually leading towards putting more decision making in the hands of actual workers and working people?
Thanks, Hector. I know that we are getting close to time, and I want to make sure we have the chance to answer some questions from folks who are tuning in. So I'm going to close us out with kind of last thoughts. And while I'm doing that, if folks have questions that you'd like to ask of the panelists, please put them in the chat, and we'll make sure that we have a few minutes at the end to do that. So Randy, want to close out with you, both to see if there's anything you want to add to the conversation on industry partnerships and apprenticeship, and then want to talk about kind of last thoughts after that.
Sure, yeah, so just a couple of quick thoughts. One thing that we have learned with the Infrastructure Academy, we have put together a steering committee that includes pretty high level leadership from industry associations as well as actual businesses that operate in the field. So when you have those kind of folks at the table, you have to give them something meaty to deal with. So if you've ever sit in on Perkins advisory council meetings, that's not the kind of thing we're talking about. You need to give them a challenge. You need to respect and seek to derive some real help from their experience. So being very deliberate about who you bring to the table and what you ask of them. And then on the apprenticeship front, coming from a state where we're a right to work state, apprenticeship is often viewed kind of quizzically. One thing that we have done that has helped to advance apprenticeships and pre-apprenticeships is some of our colleges have started to work as intermediaries in apprenticeship. So they help businesses negotiate the hoops that you have to go through to get registered apprenticeship done, which relieves them of the pressure, but also benefits us by, one, having closer relationships with business, but two, also advancing more students into the apprenticeship related instruction, which we provide. So finding ways to, and I'm speaking specifically from a community college standpoint, finding ways to allow the college to continue to be a solution for business, and to bridge some of those hurdles that state agencies can often put in front of.
Thanks. So I'm hearing just a huge theme around the importance of meaningful partnerships across the sector between workers, between industry leaders, and between all of the different organizations that work with workers and businesses, from community colleges to community-based organizations. So I want to just give you all one last question, and I noticed that Molly liked this question, so I hope you all will like it too. I want to ask, what's one piece of advice you would give to state and local advocates who want to see their policymakers invest in the kinds of things we've been talking about today, right? Invest in the people who can power our infrastructure and make investments to advance a more equitable infrastructure workforce. So I'm going to start with you, Randy, and then I'm going to go to Shinga, and then to you, Hector, and then we'll have a few minutes for Q&A.
Sure. So know your data, have the data, be able to tell a story that is clear, concise, and compelling, whether that is about what you do or what you should do or what they should do. Have data. And then the second thing is set your own priorities. Our new strategic plan in Virginia for community colleges is focused solely on equity of outcomes for students. So demonstrate what you want others to demonstrate.
So I'll go. I guess one piece of advice I can give is intentionality. You know, you can't really have the results that you want for promoting diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility unless you intentionally build these into your program design, into your pre-apprenticeship and apprenticeship programs, and have a laser sharp focus on that, you know, throughout your program implementation. So, I mean, I can share more on the data side, you know, how do you provide the cost benefit type of analysis to not only convince your businesses, but also your funders that this is really going to pay off. We have a lot of documentation on that. DOL has that for apprenticeship. So that's all for some future discussions.
Yeah, I agree 100% with both of those. But I also really liked what Molly and Paige mentioned. They said, you know, convening the power and wisdom of local agencies and organizations. Well, at Jobs to Move America, we call that organizing. We call that coalition building, and, you know, getting together with like-minded folks to really change training and hiring and working conditions for our communities. So I encourage folks to think a little bit more about creating the political will. You all are the workforce experts already. The data exists in so many ways. There are so many reports to back up the kinds of changes that we need to make training and career advancement more equitable. It's up to us to really build up the political will to make it happen. And to do that, we have to organize.
Thank you. And as a coalition, I would just underscore organizing, advocate with a common vision and voice for sure. Folks should please drop in questions into the chat. We have just a few minutes left. In the meantime, I saw that some questions did come in. One of the questions that we have is really about what it looks like to bring community members into training for for infrastructure jobs. And so one of the things I know that we kind of touched on throughout our conversation, but was partnering with community-based organizations who might be doing intensive outreach, might be providing services in community, who really know the local communities where they're based. And so I'm wondering if anybody can kind of speak to what you see as partnerships with community-based organizations in the places where you work. Any takers? Hector?
I can share one quick example, especially as it relates to the building trades. One of our longstanding coalition partners, the Anti-Recidivism Coalition in Los Angeles, has worked specifically to get folks who are re-entering society out of incarceration into building trades pathways. They have a landmark second chance, we call it Second Chance Construction Careers Program in partnership with the Los Angeles County Federation of Labor, exclusively for systems impacted individuals that they support with their expertise and coaching and mentorship, but through partnership with trainers and the building trades, are exposed to the array of building trades opportunities and apprenticeship programs, and complete the multi-craft core curriculum, which I'm sure many folks are familiar with, so that they can have their pick of which sort of skilled trade they want to enter. That's been an amazing model that we wish to replicate for manufacturing, for similar populations, for women or for workers of color specifically. They're a really, really phenomenal kind of partnership and program to check out.
And I'll throw three quick things out, Brooke. One, we are very closely aligned with our United Way. And if folks on the call are not familiar with the ALICE report that they have conducted in about 14 states, you might want to check that out. We are very, very focused on the ALICE population in Virginia. We are very closely aligned with our Department of Social Services, which includes SNAP and TANF and other supportive services that give you access to the kind of folks who really need us more than anybody probably. And then finally, I would say if you are in an agency or if you are in a training provider situation, be willing to invest, spend some money, find out what your partner's motivations are and their pain points are, and help them overcome them. It's not a one-way street.
Yeah, I just want to underscore there, Randy. Oftentimes, I think community-based organizations are asked to support recruitment and referrals and supportive services, but we don't always invest in the resources required for organizations to do that. And so I would just definitely say +1 to that. Also just want to +1 to the Anti-Recidivism Coalition in California. They have been a partner of ours in our California work, including a worker equity initiative that we staff in partnership with the UCLA Labor Center. And then finally want to underscore, Randy, the way that you lifted up human service agencies. And National Skills Coalition recently released a report about the opportunity for community colleges to partner with human service agencies, particularly thinking about how we can use SNAP and TANF resources, blend it with and braid it with training resources to create economic mobility and equity. We can get a link to folks to that report, but interesting to tie that then specifically to infrastructure training as well. Shinga, was there anything you wanted to add on that last question before we close?
Just a quick example of the GCRTA in Cleveland. In building their apprenticeship program, they work with the El Barrio Workforce Development Center, which is a local community-based organization, as well as the Cuyahoga Community College, Tri-C. And that kind of three-way partnership really helps them reach out to the community and the, existing community college student population, which also is quite diverse, to recruit the next generation of transit workers. And it's not just community colleges, but high schools, CTE high schools. So need to, grab their attention early, and when they're, still in the stage of exploring, and, getting counselors and parents involved in this discussion. So they're really aware of transit's frontline jobs as future careers for their students.
Absolutely. And I know we got a question about what outreach looks like from one of our partners in Ohio. So thank you for making that connection. And so I think we're at time. We use the time that we have today. I just want to thank our terrific panel of speakers, as well as Paige and Molly and Megan, for spending an hour and a half sharing their experience and perspectives with us. We talked about industry partnerships a lot today, and in fact, that is what our next Summit sequel is about. So please sign up for that if you want to learn more about industry partnerships and how they can advance equity and job quality. We will have one of the lead researchers on California's high road training partnerships joining us for that, and so you can hear more about that particular model. It's at June 29th at 1 p.m. Eastern time. And you can register now using the link that's being dropped in the chat. So thank you again, Hector, Shinga, Randy, Molly, Megan, and Paige. Thank you, Katie, for your work on the chat, and our wonderful communications team for helping us with all of this. And thank you to all of you for participating today. Take good care.